All right, let's talk about Keynes. Now, quick aside, just something that came to mind, especially going through the Buchholz reading. Our knowledge is embedded in a network of prior knowledge. The more that you know, the easier it is to learn more stuff. Buchholz has been a really fun writer. I've been really enjoying reading his stuff. It also kind of jumps out at me. A lot of the times he'll make references to things that we obviously don't have time to cover. They're kind of, asides, but just kind of something that jumps out at me. It's good to try to establish a broad base of knowledge because it really puts you at an advantage for building up more knowledge. Another aside, the final presentation check-in number 1 went very well. Like I mentioned on Discord, about half of you, I didn't really even have much to add. Just kind of keep at it. In some cases, I saw a lot of progress, which is great. Some initial drafts of PowerPoint presentations is what I like to see. Some I saw a little bit less, more kind of acknowledgement that the project is still there, and some thoughts about how to narrow the focus a little bit, but keep at it. If you don't see a grade for that check-in, send me an email. But if you do, then check in the assignment for any feedback or suggestions that I might have. Feel free to ignore or use them as you see fit. It is ultimately your presentation. But for a few of them, I did have some suggestions or maybe some ideas that might help you to focus a little bit. All right, so with Keynes really changed things. Keynes is often thought of as the father of macroeconomics. Before Keynes, all economics was basically microeconomics. Now, that said, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, all the economists we've talked about, all the economists before Keynes, we didn't talk about, maybe not all, but many economists before Keynes were thinking about these sorts of questions. Adam Smith's book was The Wealth of Nations. That is very much a macroeconomic title. That said, what Keynes basically added was aggregating a lot of things, right? This is sort of the key change, the key shift is going from thinking about individuals to thinking about collective, everything lumped together. Now, one argument we should think about in favor of this approach is the fallacy of composition. Let's pull up the Wikipedia page for that. The idea of the fallacy of composition is that you might think about something at one level, but when you look at a different level, you might think sometimes the lower level or the other way of looking at something applies to the different levels, but sometimes when you're looking at something, say at a small level and then a large level, at the different levels you should be thinking about things differently. So if you think about what makes sense to do with a family, that's going to be very different than what makes sense to do with an entire nation. So, some examples here. A lot of this is just sort of stuff at an individual level is one thing, right? A runner runs fast, therefore everyone runs fast and everyone wins the race. Doesn't work, right? Because the nature of a group of people running is different than the nature of one person running. Likewise, the nature of what one firm does within an economy isn't necessarily the same thing as what everyone in the economy does. So the big Keynesian idea here is it might be very sensible for an individual household or an individual business to think about saving, paying down debt, cutting back on spending. But if everyone does it, then that can push us into this, vicious cycle where I stop spending and as a result you stop getting income from me, and so you stop spending and then someone else loses out on income, and when we all stop spending we kind of collectively shoot ourselves in the foot. Now a counterpoint to this point on aggregation is that we also miss out on information. Let me see if I can get an article I was just reading this morning, which it's not letting me get to right now, was about the returns to a college education. When we look at the average for returns on investment of you put time into getting a college degree, you give up opportunity to earn income while you're in school, you face all these costs, but on average, people with a college degree end up making more money than people without a college degree. Right? That average is an aggregation. We're just lumping all the stuff together. On the other hand, when we do that, we also miss out on some specific information about specific people within the whole group of people who go to college. So in this article I was reading from The Economist, I think it was saying something like 1/3 of students get a negative return on their investment. It depends on the school they go to, it depends on the major, what they're studying, how they're studying. But this thing that we tell everyone of go to college, it's a good investment, although it's true on average, aggregating to that average throws out some information. It doesn't mean that any college degree is a good idea. About 1/3 of students get a negative return on their investment. Those students would do well to not pay attention to the aggregate detail that on average people do well. All right. Before I forget, let's talk a little bit about Say's law and then jump back into some of the things that Keynes did to change economics as a discipline. So the sort of bumper sticker version of Say's law is supply creates its own demand. Let's just pull up a supply and demand graph just so I have something to point at as I'm thinking through this. The notion of supply and demand we need to think about as microeconomists. What demand is your willingness and ability to pay for some product. Now, your ability to pay for some product depends on you having given something up. So let's say this is the supply and demand for books. So I buy this book. I was part of the demand for this book. I had to give up something else. Now, obviously, I did not sell a copy of this exact book from James Buchanan. Instead, I sold my labor as an economics professor. Right? Or I could have sold investments I own, I could have sold other books that I own, but I had to give up something besides what I am demanding. So fundamentally, demand for one thing is, on the flip side, representing the supply of all other things. Demand for this one particular book is backed up by the fact that people are supplying things outside of this market. Right? By the same token, the publishers of this book, they are supplying this book. Why are they supplying? Why are they willing and able to sell this? Well, they're doing it because they expect to get paid, and with that payment, they expect to be able to demand other things. So we have this inherent connection. The supply of one product is the demand for everything else. The demand for that one product is the flip side of supply of all other products. So this is really what's going on behind the scenes in Say's law. You can't buy something unless you had sold something before. You only sell something so that you're able to buy something in some other market, right? There is this inherent connection. All right, what did Say write? A product is no sooner created than it, from that instant, affords a market for other products to the full extent of its own value. All right, let's break that down. A product is no sooner created than it affords a market for other products to the full extent of its own value. So I make this book and I'm getting ready to sell it, and that is affording me the opportunity to participate in different markets. So when we think about the economy overall, and we kind of assume away time, this is really going to be the key thing here. If we think in the long run, there's got to be this connection. Now, it might be that I make this book, I send this out into the world, put that back on the shelf before I forget it and my pile grows. I put this out into the world in order to be able to demand other things. Now, it might be that I publish a book that people aren't that interested in, and then I have to cut my price, and then I am poorer than I thought I would be. But even so, our supply and demand system is pushing us in this direction where I sell something, it turns out people aren't that into it, so I have less ability to demand other products, but there's still this inherent connection between them. Now, in a case like that where I made a mistake as an entrepreneur, the people that the paper providers, the printers, all the people that I'm paying money to, the people that I'm basically losing money to because I'm paying them more than it's worth to the consumers, the people buying my product, my mistake means that I end up poor, but it also means that they end up relatively wealthier, right? So this connection between supply of one thing and demand of everything else, and vice versa, that can't really go away. Now, Keynes disputes this notion, and I think what makes his dispute work is the element of time. So a big part of the Keynesian framework is thinking about, a big key is the demand for cash. So why do you want cash? Well, it has to do with how you're thinking about planning the use of resources or the consumption of resources over time. You want cash because you want something relatively short run rather than something relatively long run. So one way that we might expect this in a system in equilibrium, what we would expect is if I save money, I stop spending as much as I was, and I put my money in the bank. Now the bank has more money to lend out to borrowers who are borrowing that money to undertake some long-run project. So I don't want the long-run project, someone else does, and so we're able to move resources in that direction. But there is this point of, what if the bank has money to lend, but nobody wants to borrow it? What if no one has any ideas for projects that seem like a sensible idea under the circumstances? This could be the case under a Keynesian-type recession. This class isn't about macro per se, but I think it's worth taking a quick look at how to think about these macro topics, how to think about types of recessions. And a very nice illustration of this is at MRU.org, Marginal Revolution University. Under their Principles of Macro class, they've got some different, let's see if I can go to overview. They've got different explanations of different types of recessions. So Keynes introduced a type of recession. Man, my browser is just slowing down. I think it's time to stop using Firefox. Here we go, business cycle theories. So the Keynesian idea of a recession is where we have less economic activity than the capacity of our economy, less activity, less than full employment, because basically I'm not buying because you're not buying, and you're not buying because I'm not buying, and we get this vicious cycle, right? This point of, if I'm not buying your stuff, you can't afford to buy my stuff, and then we both end up worse off than if we could just kind of trick ourselves into doing the thing, again, fallacy of composition, the thing that on an individual level doesn't make sense, which is spend money you don't have, could be good on the aggregate level, because it means that we're no longer stuck in this trap. So, if we think about, an example of this, a very common cause of this type of recession, it very often originates in the housing market. At least in the US in the last 100 years or so, most recessions have their roots in basically miscoordination in the housing market. Why? Because housing is a market that involves these long-run plans. Time becomes much more important here, and we have more opportunity for this miscoordination, this misalignment between, say, the plans of savers and the plans of investors. Now, again, to this point on aggregation. So if we think about, there's a recession caused by a drop in demand for housing. What should we do? Well, the Keynesian advice is spend more. Well, where do we spend more? Well, we could just start burying money in a disused mine and let the market come up with a plan to start digging that out. And with that plan, they're going to hire workers. They're going to increase the income going into people's pockets. Those people with more income are going to be able to spend more. And we can pull ourselves out of this recession, even with a really bad idea, right? A really economically inefficient plan, something that we wouldn't want to do under normal circumstances. If we've got a whole bunch of unemployed people, it might be better than doing nothing at all. But if our recession is caused by a problem in the housing market, how much good would it do for us to have the government spend a bunch of money in, say, high tech? Hire a bunch of tech workers to update the systems involved in state and federal government. So, as an example, at the beginning of COVID, a lot of states had a big problem with a dramatic increase in unemployment claims, and it was really difficult for them to find coders who could maintain and upgrade the systems that they had built many years ago. They needed to find Fortran coders to, increase to maintain and build these tech systems. But if we've got unemployed construction workers and we're pushing money into tech, that money isn't necessarily going to where it needs to go, right? So this is one of the things we have to be careful with when we aggregate. We're losing information, and so we might misdirect our efforts. So you consider government comes up with this public works project if we're going to upgrade the tech systems, but the tech market wasn't as impacted by the recession. We're going to not be nearly as effective as if we instead said, let's do a public works project where we hire a bunch of unemployed construction workers. That much more targeted approach is going to do a much better and cheaper job of getting us out of that Keynesian recession. Now, before I close this tab, this is one form of a recession. We'll see this upcoming week. The monitors have a very similar view on recessions. They just have a different view on how to get out of recessions effectively. We'll see a little bit of real business cycle theory, and we did touch on Austrian business cycle theory a little bit in this past week's reading. But Keynesian recessions are not the only type of recession. Very, very important to understand that. Some recessions very much look like Keynesian recessions and should be met with Keynesian policies. But if we have a recession that matches real business cycle theory, the Keynesian approach is not going to work. Right? A good example of that is the pandemic. Right? So during the pandemic, the problem wasn't that I'm not buying because you're not buying because I'm not buying. The problem was we had a pandemic. It was unsafe. It was a new thing. We didn't know how unsafe it was going to be. We didn't know what to do about it. And so we just shut everything down to try and wait it out. Trying to stimulate an economy in that setting is not going to work. Right? So all the money the federal government spent, it was not a Keynesian stimulus. It was much more of a social safety net. And the inflation that we're seeing now really drives home that point that it was not a Keynesian type recession that we had. So, aggregation, right? We spend a bunch of money in tech instead of construction. We're not going to do a very good job of getting out of that recession. So, what do we do? Well, we could, direct our efforts in a more sensible way. We could, basically try to, well, there's kind of a spectrum here, right? On the one hand, just throw money at the problem in general is the exact opposite of micromanaging. If we go too far in the other direction where we are micromanaging the economy, we're going to also do very poorly. We run into a knowledge problem. That's very much an Austrian idea here. The big goal of an economy is to rationally allocate scarce resources, but if we try to have bureaucrats do that, we're missing out on a lot of the key information necessary to make wise use of those resources. So, in a nutshell, right, what is Keynes doing? One important contribution is he introduces this notion of a Keynesian recession. And the Great Depression, we'll see next week a monetarist argument for the cause of it, but that monetarist argument about the cause of the Great Depression is still fundamentally a Keynesian explanation where the problem is everything freezes up because people aren't buying, because people aren't buying, because people aren't buying, right? This cycle. It feeds on itself and things get worse. Another important thing is as Keynes's ideas gained popularity, as they kind of became the de facto common sense, it really had an effect on the informal institutions. So if we look at the U.S. federal government surplus or deficit, when we look at the beginning of the century, right, 1915, here's basically pre-World War I, through to the end of World War II. Mostly it's right along this zero line. Right? We've got very small surpluses right after World War I. We end up with deficits during the Depression, right? But fairly small, right? Also notice here's 1929, the start of the Great Depression, and then here is the recession within the Depression. We got that here, the Great Depression. Let's pull up this graph. So you saw unemployment rise dramatically, basically as FDR takes power. Things start to respond, and then FDR's policies start to come in, and we end up with a recession within the Great Depression. And then that comes to an end with World War II, right? Very Keynesian story here. We get this big spending project. Suddenly we have a lot of aggregate demand that pulls people out of unemployment. Now, was it a good idea? I think something like the Hoover Dam, which we are still getting returns from, is a much more sensible economic investment than, say, launching a plane into Germany and blowing it up. Right? So the microeconomics of World War II, an absolute mess. But we do have, some evidence supporting the Keynesian notion that we can have a recession where the problem is that even if we're not spending sensibly, having some spending might be the right way to get out of that problem. Now, back to this point of the shift in institutions. Politicians were expected to basically balance budgets. And then here, during the Depression, Keynes is writing his ideas on macroeconomics. He's publishing the general theory. And after that, things start to change. Whoops, where we go? There we go. So, World War I, we run a deficit. In between, we basically balance the budget. Great Depression, we're running deficits because it's hard not to. World War II, massive deficits because World War II is a big deal, and the government was not concerned with sensible economics. They were concerned with trying to win the war. Post-war, we run a surplus, and then things get weird after that, right? So we're around the line. We've got deficits, sometimes surpluses, but we're within $10 billion of zero, right? We're pretty close. Then 1957, we've got a surplus. And then as we go further into the future, basically what we see is no more surpluses. Deficits become the norm, right? Little surplus in 1969. We get another one in 1998, 1999. Whoops, where'd it go? So here's World War II, massive deficits. And then in the 70s, we get stagflation, right? This is when the Keynesian consensus really falls apart. So we're doing all this fiscal policy and it's just not working, and we're getting massive deficits because we're trying to run a deficit to get out of this recession, or these sets of recessions in the 70s, really. And then really big deficits under Ronald Reagan. A lot of this is just high military spending. So back here, again, World War II, gigantic deficits. And then those are blown out of the water in the 70s and 80s, right? But basically, you can see this change in common sense. So by the end of the 50s, this is when the Keynesian view really becomes the consensus that sometimes we need to run deficits. Having a balanced budget might be a bad idea in the short run if we are in a recession. Now, the trouble is that common sense is very much around during a recession, but during these recoveries, that common sense becomes much less common, right? It becomes much easier to say we are going to run a deficit even when things are expanding, even though Keynes thinks we should be running a surplus when things are going well. You change the incentives, right? We'll talk a little bit more about this in the public choice chapter. When we change political incentives, we end up going from mostly balanced budgets to, hey, we should have a deficit if there's a recession, to we always have deficits. Right? So we get a little surplus at the end of Bill Clinton's term, and then the 21st century, massive deficits, right? And basically no sign that these are going to go away. We might get smaller deficits sometimes, but the politics are just too strong here. Politicians have too much incentive to spend. very little, they have counter incentives to raise taxes. If you raise taxes, you're going to get voted out of office. If you cut spending, you're going to get voted out of office. And the result is we end up with perpetual deficits, which really harm our ability to respond to Keynesian type recessions. That brings up a small point that would be a good idea for a final presentation for anyone still looking for a topic, which is the difference between discretionary fiscal policy and rules-based fiscal policy. So if we're in a recession, we might want sensible politicians to come up with the idea of let's do something to get out of this recession, but we might not find sensible politicians. Certainly in your lifetime, there probably has never been a sensible politician who's had the political capital to even show up on news, to show up on the TV. But that distinction, discretionary versus rule-based policy, is a very important concept to think about, important idea to explore, and would be a good final presentation topic. And then on the closing of the chapter, sort of a philosophical point that I think is worth expanding on is this chapter really closed on the point that ideas matter. In philosophy, there's kind of this distinction between idealism and materialism. And in common parlance, we hear these words and we think idealism, that means being idealistic. And materialism, that means being a consumerist, right? Wanting more stuff. But it's not that in a philosophical context, right? It's a little bit of jargon. To philosophers, materialism means what Marx was talking about, which is it's the physical reality of the world that drives history. So when we add new technology that changes the way that we process raw resources, that's going to have an impact on the material nature of our economy and our society, and that's going to result in the big historical events that we write about. Idealism is the notion that it's ideas that matter, right? We create reality as we understand it, as we learn, as we interpret it, and it's what's in our head that really drives things. Keynes had a big impact on ideas and what sort of ideas were occupying different people's brains, and that change in ideas had a big shift in history post-Keynes, right? We can see this for sure with government deficits. And of course, it's kind of ironic that Marx thought that it was material things that mattered so much, but really his ideas ended up having a huge impact on history. Of course, it's not really is it ideas or material that matters. It's not an either or, it's really both, right? Ideas are embedded in a physical environment. Both of them matter. But we look at particular cases and we can say, it's more idealism versus more materialism. And Keynes is definitely a case where Keynes's impact really had to do with ideas. All right, so Keynes, big name, very controversial after his death. A lot of debate. We'll see some of that as we talk about monetarism. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more illustration on the Austrian business cycle theory. Like I said, mru.org is a good source for this. But my browser is not cooperating with me, but I would definitely recommend checking that out, not necessarily for this class, but just for rounding out your understanding of macroeconomics. We've seen one theory of recessions here. It's good to have multiple tools, right? Again, like I was saying at the beginning, our ability to learn, our ability to grow our knowledge rests on our ability to connect that to other pieces of knowledge. So learning more about different theories of recessions is going to help make it easier for you to make sense of those ideas. Having a broad base of knowledge is helpful. All right, so this next week we're going into monetarism. In the week after, we're going to have another check-in for the final project, so make sure you're making progress on those. If you want feedback on those, come to office hours, virtually or in person, or send me email, whatever you want. I'm happy to talk about your projects. If you have any other questions, let me know in the usual places, and I will talk to you in the future.